The wind on Salisbury Plain didn't blow so much as roll, a long, slow breath across miles of chalk and cropped grass that lifted dust from the tank ruts and carried it in veils. Corporal Jamie Hughes tasted it without meaning to. Dry, mineral. A grit you could feel between your back teeth. He nudged the focus on his spotting scope until the far berm sharpened, and the tin silhouette went from a gray smudge to a clean-edged man shape out beyond the kind of distance that made your pulse a little jumpy. Heat shimmer bent the air like a mirage seen through a kettle lid. A skylark hung somewhere almost invisible, pouring sound into the sky as if it were mocking them all. "Again," Staff Sergeant Riley Shaw said, not loudly, but it carried. He stood behind the line, hands resting on the straps of his chest rig, like a man trying not to clench his fists. The lads shifted on their mats, screens glowed, kestrels chirped. Range cards with careful pencil scrawlings lay clipped and flapping. Somebody's flask of tea clicked shut with a guilty sound. Hughes read his numbers off without looking up. 1400. Mirage light left to right at 1K. Flag at the target says right to left. Barrows dropped a tick. DA's up a shade. "Copy," said Shaw. "Make it speak then." The order carried a kind of promise and a threat. He'd been at it since first light, turning their frustration into urgency, urgency into more frustration. Every miss felt like it belonged to him. The shot broke with that flat, particular crack that rifles have in open country, more a slap than a bang. In the scope, Hughes saw the bullet's wake as a quiver in the shimmer, a subtle shimmering thread that drifted off the plate and kissed a patch of dust 2 body widths wide of center. The steel didn't ring. The silence after felt heavier than any noise. "Low and off," Hughes said, and he hated how small it sounded. Shaw didn't answer for a second. He tilted his head as if the wind might change its mind and offer him an apology. "That solver says 2.1 left," he muttered, half to himself. "We're not even in the same parish." Another shot. Another nothing. Behind them a Land Rover coughed and settled. The range flags clicked their halyards like loose change in a pocket. There was the faintest smell of diesel and hot brake dust from the track, and a sweeter scent, the gorse blooming somewhere sun-warmed, coconut on the edge of the wind. Hughes found the smell dizzying, like it didn't belong on a day when his numbers refused to add up. Then he noticed the man by the fence. He must have been there a while. Odd how the eye missed what didn't make noise. He stood with his weight more on one leg than the other, a long brown coat hanging straight as a plumb line despite the breeze, cap pulled low. He had a canvas satchel over his shoulder and a laminated pass in a cheap holder on a lanyard that had seen better days. In his right hand he gripped something wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric darkened in places the way old canvas looks after 50 years of weather and touch. He didn't lean in, didn't peer. He watched like a man who had already learned what suffered when you stared too hard. Shaw followed Hughes's glance and stiffened the way a dog does at a rattle. He looked from the fence to the sentry, and then to the old man again, as if measuring a triangle that didn't suit him. "You there," he called, cold and level rather than loud. "This is a live range, you're out of bounds." The old man didn't flinch. His eyes were pale and a little watery as old eyes get, but they had that unwelcome steadiness that makes a younger man feel seen. He tapped the pass with a knuckle, not quite a defense, not quite a challenge. The sentry at the track gate, young, bored, nervous, raised a hand that was half a shrug and half a, "Yes, it's fine." Shaw's jaw twitched. "This area is closed to non-participants," he said, stepping off the gravel and onto the short grass, boots leaving little chalk crescents behind. "For your own safety, sir." For your own safety. The phrase did its usual job of not sounding like concern. The wind strengthened a fraction. The mirage danced. Hughes watched the old man's gaze travel not to the glowing screens or the metal flags, but along the line of scrub that ran like a wrinkle at 900. To a shallow dip that cut a bruise into the land at 1100, and linger on a pale patch of stone where sun pooled like water. He nodded as if some unspoken calculation had kindly confirmed itself. "Your numbers are honest enough," the old man said. the way a person remarks on the weather before stepping aside to let you pass. The voice had the rounded South Country edges of a man who grew up with hedges and hedgerows. But your bullet won't believe them. Not today. Shaw's smile came thin as wire. Won't it? You've got 3 wins, the old man said. You're treating them like one argument. No one laughed, but a couple of lads folded their mouths as if they wanted to and thought better of it. There was a relief in mockery. It gives you somewhere to put your tiredness. Hughes didn't join them. He found himself tracking that pale patch at 900, noting the shimmer that rose off it like goose fat in a hot pan. The old man had seen it too. Of course he had. "Sir," Shaw said, the title hard where it should be soft, "I have procedures to follow. You're welcome to watch from the authorized point, not here." The old man looked from Shaw to the target and back again, as if deciding whether he had time to make the kind of mistake that ends up costing somebody. "You'll want to watch that hollow," he said finally, and he pointed not at the plate, but 3 feet left of it into a wash of nothing much. "She'll roll it back on you there, sneaky as a weasel." She. Hughes liked that without wanting to. Whether as a living thing that you had to respect or it punished you, every Hillwalker's catechism dressed in different clothes. He adjusted his focus ring with fingers he tried to keep from fidgeting. In the glass, the lines of the horizon didn't quite sit still. Shaw let the silence decide the argument. "We carry on," he said to the line, and the lads shuffled into their grooves again. A minute later, the old man hadn't moved. He stood just out of the way, watching the way the grass tipped and recovered, as if something unseen had breathed on it from the wrong direction. He didn't look impatient or put out. He looked familiar somehow. Not the face, the posture. A man who has waited in worse places for longer. The next shot broke, and for a heartbeat, Hughes would have sworn the bullet took a small curve and then another. A fish flicking its tail in dark water. Dust spat behind the steel. No ring. "Off," Hughes said, and in his own ears he sounded like someone offering the last rites in a busy A&E. Steady because you have to be, dull because you don't know what else to be. He lowered his eye and flexed his shoulder. He glanced again at the satchel and the oilcloth parcel. The shape didn't look modern. It didn't look anything except old and heavy and kept. Shaw stepped closer to the fence. "Last time, sir. Back to the marked area. If you've a pass for the plane, you'll know the rules." The old man's left hand, the one not holding the oilcloth, opened and closed once at his side. The mild, involuntary clench of a body that remembers pain of the boring, permanent kind. He took 1 pace towards Shaw, not aggressive, just closer, as if he decided to risk a little offense so that he wouldn't have to shout into the wind. He smelled faintly of machine oil and wood smoke, not cologne. When he spoke, he pitched it for Shaw alone. "You're trying to bully a straight line through bent air," he said. "It'll fight you until you listen." The words weren't a taunt, and they weren't advice. They were the sort of sentence a man says to himself when he has learned it the hard way, and doesn't have the energy to make poetry of it. Hughes turned it over in his head, and felt something there click into a better gear. He moved his focus back to the dip at 1100, and watched the mirage fold back on itself. A window, then a wall, then a window. Like the tide in a rock pool when a lorry passes on a road you can't see. A battered defender rolled up the service track and stopped with a sigh of brakes. The driver, a civilian ranges clerk with a clipboard that had done more miles than most boots, leaned out and gave a little 2-fingered flick that might have meant hello or sorry or both. The old man nodded back. The clerk said, "Afternoon, Arty," and drove on. Hughes didn't mean to react. The name was simple, common, could have been anyone. Still, it put shape to the outline. Arty. Arthur. The sort of name your granddad might have had. Men who could make a gate hang true without a spirit level. A small domino fell over in Hughes's mind and set a line tumbling. Shaw heard it too. Names do things that faces can't. He glanced at the sentry again, but the lad looked away in the way lads do when they think looking at something will make them responsible for it. The old man, Arty, shifted the oilcloth parcel to his left hand, and with his right thumb rubbed the edge of the laminate pass, as if warming it might change what it said. "Rifle up," Shaw said to the line, and his tone had a new iron in it. Frustration is a kind of heat that cooks pride on one side and leaves it raw on the other. Hughes watched the next shot kiss the dirt in front of the plate and skip like a stone. It was cleanly wrong, if that made sense. No flinch, no bad trigger. Just a solution the air found amusing. He swallowed that feeling and said nothing.
Arty took a breath that made his shoulders rise and fall under the coat. "You're looking for numbers," he said, almost as if he were reading a weather forecast to himself. "Look for signs." He lifted his chin toward the pale stone again. "That's a kettle there. She boils off and tumbles. Over your bullet path, it's like 3 conversations in a crowded pub. You don't shout louder, you wait for them to breathe." Shaw let out the smallest laugh, the kind that has no humor left in it. "Do you even know what "I know what you're trying to say," Arty said. Not sharply, but quick enough to beat the word to the air before it got ideas. "I also know that when the line of hawthorn breaks the wind into ribbons, your clever watch won't see which ribbon your round will fly through." Something, a memory or an ache, went across Shaw's face and was gone. He put a foot on the lower rail of the fence and leaned in, arms folded on the top bar, the posture of a man who has decided to make himself comfortable while being disobeyed. "What's in the parcel?" he asked, almost conversational. And the almost did a lot of heavy lifting. "A thing that doesn't belong to me," Arty said. He said it in the way some people say grace. He lifted the bundle a fraction and let it fall again, the weight of it making the fabric murmur. "I'm taking it somewhere it does." "Which is?" Shaw asked. Arty's mouth pulled into what might have been a smile if you had more hope in you than Hughes did at that moment. "A little stone with 3 names on it," he said. "Up there behind your target berm. I go on the day every year, give the lads their share of the sun." He didn't say what day, but Hughes didn't need it drawn in. A knock of fate doesn't always sound like a door. Sometimes it's a small ritual carried through wind and noise because to skip it would feel like a betrayal. He felt, unexpectedly, the prickle in the nose he got when he thought of his Nan's funeral tea and how the scones tasted of salt, because half the village had cried over them while they baked. Shaw shifted, the hardness in him ruffled by the kind of truth you can't quite argue with because it doesn't make a demand. He looked like a man stepping around a bucket you can't see but know is there. Then he remembered himself. "Permit or not," he said. "You don't stand forward of the marker. That is final. Step back. Please." The please landed with the weight of a brick on velvet. Arty glanced at the marker post, made the half-pace he'd been asked for, and in doing so came into the line of shade thrown by the sentry hut. For a moment his face altered, not his features, but the way the light read them. And Hughes saw tiredness like tide marks and the small, collected dignity of a man who keeps his coat brushed even when no one is coming. Arty dipped his head once, as if to a clock he alone could hear. "You'll have your it," he said, "but not while you're shouting." He didn't mean the volume. Hughes cleaned the lens with the edge of his shirt, which he knew he shouldn't, but it was that or smear his own fingertips across it and hate himself. He took a fresh breath, held it, let half out, and this time he let his eyes drift soft the way a birder once taught him. Don't stare at the bird. Look at the hedgerow, and let the bird find you. The mirage stopped looking like soup and started to look like someone breathing behind glass. The flags argued without moving their poles. The gorse threw its sweetness like a dare. He said, before he could stop himself, "Stoff. The dip at 11's bouncing it back. There's a window for about 5 seconds when the shimmer flattens." Shaw narrowed his eyes, not at Hughes, but at the idea of being offered something he hadn't asked for. He waited. The wind waited. The range, for a heartbeat, remembered that it had been hills before it had been numbers. "Fine," Shaw said. "On the window. Hold for it."
The shooter breathed, and the world shrank to a trigger and a promise. Arty watched, not the man, not the rifle, but the patch of air the bullet would have to thread. The shot went, a flat crack, swallowed by distance. In Hugh's scope, the trace curved with grace enough to be beautiful and cruel enough to be useless. It missed. Shaw didn't swear, he didn't need to. He made a note on his range card with small, precise fury and turned his head slowly back to Arty. "There," he said. "You see the problem?" Arty nodded, and his eyes went a little far away for a heartbeat, the way they do when an old film flickers in a window nobody else can see. He adjusted his grip on the parcel and winced with a movement so small Hughes wouldn't have seen it if he hadn't been watching for it. The wince of a shoulder that had learned about recoil at an age when bones are still taking notes. "I see it," he said. "It's telling you to stop trying to win a shouting match with a hill." "Enough riddles." Shaw's patience ran out in a tidy line. He stood off the fence and beckoned to the sentry, who arrived with the horrible eagerness of a very young man invited to do something official. "Escort this gentleman to the designated observation point." The sentry faltered, then nodded, eyes on Arty's laminated pass as if it might flare red and spare him the choice. Arty didn't move. He looked at Shaw the way some people look at a church when they're not praying but remembering how. "I'll step back," he said, "but if you want your plate to sing today, you'll wait for the cloud bank to reach that stand of thorn. When the sun goes, you'll lose your kettle and your ribbon. You'll have one clean breath of air. Do it then." Shaw's laugh came out like a cough he regretted. "We'll be done before that." "No," Arty said, and his voice had no sharpness in it, only the softness of certainty. "You won't." Hughes glanced at the horizon line. The cloud bank was a long, slow ship, lazy and inevitable. It would be 20 minutes, maybe more. He felt the small, irrational relief of being given a time that didn't belong to his watch. He also felt the prickle that comes when you sense the story is bigger than the page you're reading. He tucked it away the way you tuck away a spare round, quietly, and where your fingers can find it later. The sentry gestured. Arty nodded and went to step back, and in that movement the oilcloth parcel slid a couple of inches and exposed for a flash a corner of oiled walnut the color of old tea and a sliver of steel kissed thin along its edge. Not modern, not mass-produced, kept. Shaw saw it, and the look that crossed his face was not contempt and not curiosity, but something you see when a man recognizes a shape his hands already know. He masked it quickly. "That," Shaw said, too casual, "belongs in a museum." Arty's eyes flicked to the parcel and then away, as if checking on a sleeping child. "It belongs on a hill," he said, "which is nearly the same thing if you do it right." He stepped back to the post and hooked his thumb in the satchel strap to ease the weight off that old shoulder. Hughes swallowed and returned his eye to the glass, and the day held itself at that unbearable pitch ranges have when nothing happens and everything is happening. The wind rolled again, patient, amused, and entirely itself, while somewhere up on the ridge a stone waited for a man to finish a ritual that would bring it the warmth of a palm for a minute and a story for another year. And though no one said it, though no one even let the words form properly in the privacy of their own heads, because to name a thing too soon is to frighten it away, something had knocked, that soft, fatal knock you only hear if you've earned it, the kind that sounds like a stranger at a fence asking you, politely, to stop shouting at the wind and listen. The silence hung longer than it should have. Not respectful silence. Awkward, drawn silence. The kind you get after someone says something true at the wrong moment. Shaw turned away from the line without a word. He'd been standing too long with his jaw clenched, and the muscles along his cheek had started to tick in rebellion. He flexed them now with a grimace, a low burn building in his gut. Not quite anger, not quite humiliation. Something heavier, older, like being corrected in public by a teacher you hated and admired in equal measure. Hughes pretended to be engrossed in rechecking his dope sheet. He wasn't. He was watching Arty out the corner of his eye, still standing quiet behind the marker post. The man didn't lean, didn't fidget, just stood, like he'd been grown out of the chalk. "Back on the glass," Shaw barked. "Target 3. Spotters call the mirage in 30-second windows. Shooters hold until I say otherwise." There was a flurry of nods, movement, the mechanical rhythm of training snapping back in place. Almost. The lads were good, tight, professional, but Hughes could feel it, an undertow, that strange ripple when the story of the day no longer belongs to the man in charge. And Shaw felt it too. That's what stung the most. He crouched by the firing mat, closer than he needed to be. "Try the damn window," he muttered to Lance Corporal Pike, whose fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the windage dial. "If the ghosts are right, the bullet should dance between them." Pike didn't reply. He just nodded once, shallow and sharp. The crack came clean. Hughes followed the trace, willing it straight, clean, honest. It wasn't. The shot yawned left and vanished in heat. No clang, no ring. Just disappointment in its quietest form. Shaw stood slowly, brushing the gravel dust off his kneecaps with excessive force. "Staff," someone muttered near the end of the line. "I swear I saw it bend." "What was that?" Shaw snapped, already knowing who it was. O'Driscoll, the youngest. A kid who still over-oiled his rifle like it was going to rust in his sleep. "Nothing, Staff," the boy said quickly. Shaw turned on his heel and walked toward the marker line, toward Arty. Not fast, not slow, measured. His boots crunched in rhythm with his breath. "You've had your look," Shaw said, standing just inside the regulation distance, addressing the old man with a calm too smooth to be real. "I've asked you politely. I've let you speak your piece. Now I'm telling you this isn't your playground. It's not your war, and these aren't your lads." Arty didn't blink. That's true. It was the sort of agreement that offered no peace. Shaw narrowed his eyes. "So why are you still here?" "I told you," Arty said, his voice low, almost warm. "I've got a promise to keep." Shaw stepped closer, the toe of his boot brushing the marker post. "You keep that promise at the designated observation point, not near live fire, not in the middle of my range." The lads had gone quiet again. You could hear the kestrels chirping on the wind meters and the low static hum from the comms repeater tower half a mile away. The plain felt wide and hollow all of a sudden, like a cathedral too large for the number of people in it. "You think I'm trying to embarrass you," Arty said gently. "I don't think anything," Shaw replied, his voice starting to strain around the edges. "You're a civilian with a memory problem and a hard-on for nostalgia." A few heads twitched, a pause. Hughes felt his neck go tight, the way it did before a punch in a bar. But Arty only raised his eyebrows, as if Shaw had surprised him with how little he actually knew. He shifted the parcel in his hands. "Tell me, Sergeant, when was the last time you fired with your ears?" Shaw gave a humorless laugh. "We don't play shaman games here, Grandpa. We use tech that works." Arty nodded once. "And still your lads haven't hit a thing in 3 hours." The tension snapped like a frozen branch. Shaw's eyes flared. "You know what I think?" he said, stepping forward, voice rising half a note. "I think you're just an old relic with a field pass and a story. I think you were somebody once, and now you're not. You hang around the memorials like ghosts will talk to you, and you carry a bloody antique around like it means something." He pointed at the oilcloth bundle. "What's in there anyway? Your bedtime teddy? Or are you planning on showing these boys how real men used to miss shots?" Arty slowly unwrapped a corner. Wood, walnut darkened by oil and time. Steel, aged and hand-worn. A bolt-action rifle with a scope that had no fancy turrets, no built-in level, no Bluetooth compatibility. Just simple dials and a lens you had to trust. The L42A1 Enfield, British Sniper Classic, Falklands issue, custom rebarreled .308 with match optics. Museum stuff, or legend stuff, depending on who you asked. Shaw's laugh died in his throat. "Jesus," someone whispered behind them. "That's the one from the display cabinet, the real one." Arty ran his thumb gently along the edge of the stock, pausing at a deep gouge near the bolt housing. "That one?" he said softly. "That's where a bit of rock came off a wall outside Stanley and kissed her good. Hit the scope cap first, knocked my reticle crooked for the rest of the op. Had to shoot low and right for hours. Got used to it." He said it like you might talk about a limp you learned to walk around. Shaw stared. "You carried that in?" But the question didn't come out. He didn't want the answer. "You don't have to believe me," Arty said. "I didn't come here to convince anyone. I came here to tell 3 names hello, and to see if the air still sings the way it used to." Shaw was already folding his arms. "This is a closed op. I don't care what you've dragged through the years. You're in the way. And you're missing shots," Arty replied. Hughes felt the hairs on his arm stand up, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The lines in Shaw's face had settled. The mask was back on, but tighter this time. "Get your scope," Shaw said, not to Arty, to Hughes. "Take it to the ranger's shed. Tell them the reticle's out. Make yourself useful." Hughes didn't argue, didn't flinch. He stood, tucked the scope under his arm, and nodded. "Yes, staff." But he didn't head toward the shed. He slipped behind the line of parked troop carriers, eyes sharp. His fingers danced over the screen of his burner phone. He scrolled to a number saved only under one word. Albion. 1 ring. 2. Regimental Sergeant Major Whitaker speaking. "Sir," Hughes said quickly. "Corporal Hughes, I need to flag a situation." "Go on." "There's a civilian on range 2. Observation post past but forward of line. Sergeant Shaw's got him backed off, but, sir, he's carrying an old L-42. I think it's Collins." The pause on the other end wasn't just quiet, it was reverent. "You're certain?" came Whitaker's low, clipped voice. "Pretty certain, sir. He called the wind bounce from the hollow, and he's not rattled, sir. Like he belongs here more than us. Don't let Shaw push him. Don't let anyone touch him. You hear me?" "Yes, sir. I'll make the call." Hughes ended the call and looked back toward the range. Arty had re-wrapped the rifle and was now seated quietly on the bench, arms crossed over the bundle, eyes closed as if listening to the wind talk. Shaw stood, stiff and bristling near the firing line, and the sky above them held a stillness Hughes recognized from one place only. A place where something big was about to happen. But none of the birds had flown yet. Arty Collins didn't move much. He didn't need to. Sitting on the long wooden bench just behind the safe line, arms crossed over the oilcloth-wrapped rifle, he looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because of a lanyard pass or a clipboard clearance, but because the land itself seemed to accept him. The grass didn't part, the air didn't hush. But everything around him allowed his stillness, like it would the shadow of a tree that had always been there. Staff Sergeant Shaw paced. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't neutral either. A quiet, precise sort of pacing that said, "I want them to think I'm unbothered." He adjusted the sling on his rifle 3 times, checked the time, checked the wind, checked the time again. Ordered a shooter back onto the glass, changed the mirage reading, dismissed it, then barked at Pike to re-zero, even though there was no real point. The miss hadn't been catastrophic, just wrong enough to embarrass him. The kind of miss that didn't break skin, but drew blood anyway. Across the bench, Arty reached into his satchel and pulled out a scrap of faded cloth, rubbing the heel of his palm across the stock through the bundle. It wasn't an idle gesture, it had a rhythm to it. Polishing. Not for shine, for memory. Corporal Hughes saw it from where he crouched behind the 3rd Humvee, phone back in his pocket now, heart thumping slightly faster than the job really called for. The wind curled through the gap between the vehicles like a nosy question. The taste of it was colder now. The cloud bank that Arty had mentioned back in Part 1, the one moving slow as a funeral across the plain, was starting to arrive. And with it came the shift, that eerie drop in shadow where everything turns slightly blue, as if the land is waiting to be told a secret. Hughes stood, slowly, as if not to wake anything. He crossed back toward the firing line, holding a clipboard he didn't need, just to look like he had purpose. Shaw clocked him returning. "You sort the scope?" Shaw asked, voice low and clipped. "Yes, Staff," Hughes lied without blinking. "Still waiting on nitrogen refill. They'll send it back in an hour." Shaw gave a noise that might have been a grunt or a curse, depending on your upbringing. "Back on spot, then. And keep your eyes open. No more ghost chasers." Hughes nodded and returned to the mat. He lowered himself into a crouch and brought his glass up to eye level. But his focus wasn't on the target. It was on Arty. The old man had finally, carefully unwrapped the rifle. The L-42A1 lay bare across his lap. It wasn't clean in the modern sense, not sterile, not match-polished. The wood was worn smooth in the spots where hands had held it 1,000 times. The bluing on the barrel had faded to a soft, ghostly charcoal. The scope, no turrets, no illumination, no rangefinder, looked like something you'd fish out of an attic and mistake for a telescope. But there was something about the shape, about how it rested, like it didn't need to prove anything anymore. Shaw watched from the edge of the line, arms crossed, mouth hard. His eyes kept drifting toward the gouge in the stock. And that's when it came, the flash. It didn't knock Arty down, didn't make him sweat, didn't send him shaking. But his eyelids fluttered for just half a second, and he was elsewhere. Falklands, 1982. Rain. Not hard, but wet. That kind of rain that never stops, just sits in your collarbone and seeps in through the seams. Arty, then Lance Corporal Collins, was lying flat in a ditch outside Goose Green, cheek on the stock, ribs against the cold. His spotter, Mackey, lay beside him, binoculars fogged, voice tight. MG nest, 30 yards past the crater, dug in. Range? 1-4, but sloping. Arty adjusted his breathing. The wind screamed uphill, channeled by the terrain like a curse. Not constant. It came in pockets. One moment left, then right. He couldn't trust the rain, couldn't trust the brush. Had to go lower. He glanced left. A low wall of broken stones. Muzzle flash there, brief. Not aimed at him yet, but soon. He adjusted the dope manually, with fingers numb and stiff from hours in the cold. The wind flag was gone, torn away. "Thermal up from the crater," Mackey said. "Hot earth from the shelling." Arty didn't nod, didn't speak. He just watched a plastic packet flutter beside a rock near the crater's lip. It rose, then fell, then rose again. That was his flag now. He shifted 1 minute left, half a minute down, let out half a breath, and fired. The L-42 barked. The recoil sang up his arm. The rifle bucked, not violently, but differently. Something hit the stock. A chip flew off, just a fragment. He felt it in his shoulder. Didn't flinch, didn't check. The MG nest stopped. Back in the present, Arty opened his eyes. The bench beneath him was dry. The rifle in his lap was whole again, but the gouge was still there, still raw, still silent. Shaw was staring, maybe not even aware he was staring. "You know what that is, don't you?" Hughes said before he could stop himself. Shaw blinked. His voice came rough. It looks like the same model we had mounted in the museum display back at Limpstone." "It is," Arty said without looking up. "That is the display one. They let me borrow it each year." Shaw frowned. "How did you—" "Because I never missed with it," Arty said simply. The line of snipers, still pretending not to be listening, shifted slightly, as if the ground had tilted under them. One of the Marines, Jenkins, muttered under his breath, "Bloody hell, that's him, isn't it?" "No names," Arty said. "That's not why I'm here."
But the look in Hughes's eyes had already changed. Not worship, he wasn't a boy, but respect. Heavy. Earned. "You made the wall shot," Hughes whispered. "The one from the Falklands. Through smoke, into thermal shimmer, at 1,400 meters. They called it luck." "They always do," Arty said, "until you do it again." Shaw stepped forward. The stiffness in his shoulders had softened just enough to suggest doubt, or shame, or both. "You carried it all this way," he said, not unkindly, "just to sit with it again?" Arty didn't answer right away. He ran a thumb down the length of the scope. The glass caught a glint of late sunlight breaking through the cloud. "No," he said. "I brought it to speak to the air, and maybe remind you lot that steel only hits when the man behind it listens more than he talks." The clouds settled fully over the range now, softening the sunlight until everything took on that flat, gunmetal sheen you get on overcast days where time stops moving forward. A kind of stillness clung to the plain, the kind that made birds hush and even radios crackle less. And in that stillness, something began to change. It started with Hughes's phone call, the one he hadn't quite been cleared to make, the one flagged as Albion Protocol. Regimental HQ, Camp Graybrook, 2.7 miles from the range. Regimental Sergeant Major Whitaker didn't shout when the word Collins came down the line. He didn't need to. He simply stood up, stepped out of the operations room, and walked with clipped pace toward a secure terminal down the hall. The sort of pace that made junior officers tuck in their shirts instinctively. He tapped a few keys. A window opened. Arthur Collins, MCL-42A1 Sniper Element, RM Commando, retired. Operation Sutton, Goose Green, 1982. Service commendations, ×12. Marked, Observer Status. Annual Access Clearance, Memorial Range, Permission. Tier 3, Historical, Legacy Exception. Whitaker exhaled through his nose. The last time he'd seen that name was 6 years ago, when a memorial plaque was raised on the inner wall of the chapel. 3 names, 1 survivor. The one who carried the bolt action through a live ambush after being left behind with the dead. He didn't even bother picking up the landline. He pulled his mobile from his pocket, scrolled to a number labeled simply G. Fletcher, CO, and pressed call. Back on the range, Staff Sergeant Shaw paced slower now. Not frustrated, just unmoored. The rhythm was off, like a metronome ticked out of sync with the tune. He'd noticed how Hughes kept glancing at Arty, now not with suspicion, but with something closer to quiet alertness. Like watching an old dog that hadn't moved in hours, but could still snap its jaws shut before you blinked. Even Pike, who rarely lifted his eyes from the scope, was sneaking looks sideways. The rifle still rested on Arty's knees, but it was no longer just a rifle. It was a center of gravity, a magnet. Shaw turned as if to reset the dynamic, and was halfway through ordering a cold barrel break when the static hit. Not from the radio. From the wind. A shift. A hush. The air changed, subtle but real. Then the soft cough of tires on gravel. Vehicles, more than one. At first it was just dust on the ridge track, easy to miss. Then the dust became shadow. The shadow became shape. 3 vehicles. 2 matte black Defender command vehicles, 1 mod pattern MP unit behind them. "Eyes on?" Hughes muttered. Pike nodded. "That's no daily transport." Shaw turned toward the road, and his body language shifted by degrees. Not fear, not yet, but anticipation. Like an officer who's been playing music a bit too loud and suddenly hears their father's footsteps on the stairs. The convoy didn't slow until it hit the turnout for the firing range. Then it stopped. Clean, synchronized. Doors didn't fly open, they opened deliberately. First came Colonel Gareth Fletcher, Royal Marine Colonel, sand-colored beret clipped at regulation angle, boots silent in the gravel, which somehow made it worse. He was not a man who smiled often,
But today his face was something colder than usual, not anger, purpose. Beside him strode RSM Whitaker, face like a cliff edge, sleeves rolled just enough to show that he still trained twice a day, even in his 50s. No clipboard, no salute yet, just movement, forward. Shaw instinctively stepped away from the bench where Arty still sat. The lads, every one of them, snapped to attention, despite having no formal call. You didn't need the call when rank arrived with weather. "Stand easy," Fletcher said.
But no one did. The colonel's eyes scanned the line like searchlights. Then he turned, deliberately, toward Arty. There was a pause. Then Fletcher drew in a slow breath and saluted. Not lazily, not with ceremonial fluff. A sharp, crisp, royal salute, straight wrist, chin up. And it held. It held longer than necessary. It held long enough for the lads to realize this wasn't a courtesy. This was a debt. Arty looked up slowly, and with a short, almost reluctant movement, he returned the gesture. A nod more than a salute, but it was enough. Whitaker stepped forward, not toward Arty, toward Shaw. "Sergeant Shaw," he said, voice low and flint sharp, "I believe you've been entertaining a guest under legacy clearance." Shaw cleared his throat. "RSM, yes. He was forward of post. I instructed him to return. He resisted. I wasn't aware of his—" Fletcher cut in. "You weren't aware," he said, voice flat, "because you didn't ask." Shaw stiffened. "No one expects you to remember every name, Sergeant, but when someone walks onto your line wrapped in oilcloth, holding history in his lap, and calls the wind better than your tech, you bloody well find out who he is before you start barking orders." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Arty hadn't moved. His hand rested lightly on the bolt, not holding it, just touching, like a pianist resting fingers on old ivory. Fletcher turned to the lads. "Gentlemen," he said, voice carrying across the chalk hills, "what you've been failing to do this morning, you failed not because of lack of discipline or effort. You failed because you're trying to fight the wind with spreadsheets." A few of them smiled, unsure if they were allowed to. "This man," he gestured toward Arty, "has done what you failed to do in 3 wars, under worse fire, with less kit, and without raising his voice." Whitaker folded his arms. "He didn't walk onto your range," he added. "He built it." The lads stilled. Shaw stared at the ground, as if searching for a hole large enough to hide an entire career. Hughes glanced sideways at Arty. The old man still hadn't said a word, still hadn't stood. He didn't need to. Colonel Fletcher stood with his boots shoulder-width apart, hands behind his back, eyes on the men, his men. His silence held them like a pin through paper. No one fidgeted, no one adjusted their sling. Even the kestrel wind meters seemed to stop chirping. Behind him, RSM Whitaker remained motionless, his presence like a closed door you know better than to knock on. The only one who moved was Arty Collins, but only slightly. He shifted the rifle across his lap, resting it flat on the bench like you'd set down a cup you'd been holding too long. The stock creaked softly where age and wood grain remembered pressure. Fletcher finally spoke. "You lot know what this is," he said, not pointing, not raising his voice. "This is the moment where someone shows up who reminds you how small you are." The words landed hard, but not cruelly, just honestly. "I had mine," the colonel continued, "when I was a second lieutenant in Basra. Thought I knew the world. Thought I could outthink a sniper with 6 months in the field and a drone on overwatch. Then an old sergeant major told me to put my fancy kit away and listen to the breeze on the back of my neck. Saved my life." He turned toward Arty. "I don't forget the men who teach me things that stick." Arty nodded slightly but said nothing. His hand rested on the bolt handle like a man touching a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. Fletcher looked back to the firing line. "Collins didn't walk onto your range to prove a point. Didn't come to correct you. He came for a reason older than this training day. Tell them," he said, glancing at Arty, voice softening just a degree.
Tell them why you're here." Arty didn't stand yet. He just looked up at the nearest man, Corporal Hughes, and held the lad's gaze as if the words were meant only for him, though they spread like fire through the rest. 42 years ago this week, he said, voice low and weathered. 3 lads I served with got dropped behind the wrong ridge near Stanley. Fog, miscomm, bad timing. You know how that goes. No one nodded. They all just listened. I was covering their sector from the southern rise. I saw them get boxed in, heard their last chatter on the net. And by the time I made my way down, they were already gone. He glanced down at the rifle again. I brought her with me. Fired 3 shots that day, through mist, rain, and gut instinct. Took out 2 that were about to desecrate the bodies. 3rd round was a waste. Missed because I was shaking too hard. He paused. I come here every year, lay this rifle down on the bench, walk up to the ridge, run my hand over the stone we placed for them. Say their names. That's it. The silence afterward was not dramatic. It was humble, sacred. Staff Sergeant Shaw's face was tight now, not defensive, not angry. Tired. Like a man finally realizing he's been arguing with a story he should have read years ago. Colonel Fletcher stepped forward once more. "Mr. Collins," he said formally, "with your permission, I'd like to ask a favor." Arty raised an eyebrow. It was the most expressive he'd been all morning. "Would you be willing to take a single shot? Same target, same range, with your own setup, no assistance, just you and your rifle." There was no challenge in Fletcher's tone, just invitation. A man asking a priest to say grace. Arty looked down at the bolt action again, ran his palm down the oiled stock as if asking it too. Then, "Aye." The word was light, but it felt like a pebble dropped in a still pond. Arty stood slowly, not like a man trying to prove he still could, just deliberately. Like everything he did was part of something older than the rules that governed the rest of them. He walked toward the prone mat, not with ceremony, but with an economy of motion that no one could miss. Every step looked like it had already been taken once, like a memory moving forward in real time. As he moved, Shaw stepped back without being asked. Not out of fear, out of deference. The shift was complete. Arty settled down behind the mat. No bipod, no bench rest. He placed the rifle on a battered rucksack, olive, sun-bleached, worn nearly smooth at the corners. Not a tool, a companion. He adjusted the sling, nestled his cheek into the comb, let out a long breath. "Your computers are looking for data," he said. Not to the colonel, not to Shaw, not even to the lads directly. He just set it into the earth, like a man remembering an old script. But the wind doesn't care about data. It rolls over chalk, through grass, off stone. And if you don't read the land, it'll lie to you with a smile. He turned the scope dials slowly. No numbers, just feel. "See that shimmer at 800, he said. "Right to left. That's thermal, off the baked stones." A few of the lads adjusted their scopes instinctively, tracking his words. "But at 1200 the grass is barely moving. That's a false low. The wind folds back on itself there." And then he nodded toward the steel plate at 1400 meters. "That flag? The one everyone's been trusting? It's lying." No one laughed. They knew he was right. Hughes spoke, half to himself. "So where do you hold?" Arty smiled, small, sad, and very real. "You don't hold. You wait. There's always a breath, a break. 5 seconds, maybe less." He breathed in again, held it, let half of it out, and waited. Every scope on the line was now trained, not on the target, but on the man behind the rifle. A breeze curled through the grass. A hawthorn branch stilled. The shimmer flattened. He fired. The sound was sharp,
nostalgic, different from the modern rifles, more intimate, like a door closing gently in a quiet house. 1,000, 1,000. Clang. The steel rang. Perfect center hit. Not a whisper out of place. The echo bounced across the plain. Not loud, just clean. And then, spontaneous applause. Not because someone told them to, because their hands forgot not to. Even Shaw clapped, slow, deliberate. Colonel Fletcher just smiled, barely, then looked toward Shaw. "You still think it belongs in a museum?" Shaw's face said everything. No. Arty sat up, Bones protesting quietly, and placed the rifle across his lap again. "This piece doesn't lie," he said. "She'll kick you if you don't hold her right. But she tells the truth. Same with the wind." Then he looked up at the lads, at all of them. "And you lot, you've been trying to shout over it." There was no need for a second shot. The ring of steel still echoed, faint now, carried across the plain by that same folding wind. Arty Collins sat back on his heels and gently lifted the rifle off the rucksack. No rush. He moved like a man packing away an instrument after the final note of a long, sacred tune. Corporal Hughes found himself holding his breath, not because he'd expected a miss, but because something about watching it hit, just once, clean and true, made you afraid to exhale too soon, like you'd break the spell. A few of the younger lads were still blinking. Jenkins, the youngest, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Pike just muttered, "Bloody hell," twice under his breath like it was a prayer. Colonel Fletcher stepped forward. He didn't clap, he didn't smile. He just said, "Thank you." Arty nodded, lifting his eyes slowly toward the tree line in the far distance, past the target, past the berm, beyond even where the wind played games with the light. His gaze landed eventually on a small rise, barely noticeable, just a patch of thorn and 3 scrubby crosses made of stone, sunk into the soil like they'd always belonged. Whitaker followed his gaze. He didn't speak either. It was known. The next hour felt different. It wasn't a formal debrief, it wasn't instruction. It was watching a man lay out the bones of the air. Arty didn't give a lecture, he didn't pull out a whiteboard or diagrams. He just walked the range with the lads, rifle slung casually over one shoulder, coat brushing the tops of the grass. And he pointed. "There," he said to Hughes, crouching next to a pile of broken chalk. "You see how the shimmer curls over the edge instead of drifting straight?" Hughes nodded, adjusting his scope. "It's like water slipping off a spoon." Arty grinned faintly. "Exactly. Your windage calculator won't catch that because it's not pressure, it's heat geometry. That spot gives your round a nudge, not a push. You plan for the push, you miss." He moved further down, planting a blade of grass between his fingers, holding it up to a low current of air. The grass flicked left, right, then settled dead still. "You feel that?" "Barely," Pike said, leaning in. "You're not supposed to feel it," Arty replied. "You're supposed to notice what it's not doing." He laid the grass on the mat and drew a rough arc in the dirt around it. "This is your lie. The range tells you the wind's steady, but it's only steady at your feet. Out there," he gestured to the middle distance, "it's dancing." One of the Marines raised a hand hesitantly. "So how do you really read it?" Arty looked down at the rifle. "Patience," he said, "and pattern. The wind's never random. It just has more rhythm than you're used to listening for." Later, back at the bench, someone asked the question out loud. "Did you always shoot like that, sir?" Arty didn't answer straight away. He pulled out a small tin from his coat, worn smooth like everything else he owned. Inside were 3 biscuits and a half tea bag wrapped in foil. He opened it carefully, passed 1 biscuit to Hughes without a word. "No one shoots like that to start," he said finally. "You learn, then you unlearn, then you remember." Hughes frowned slightly.
Remember what? Arty tapped his temple. That this, he held up the rifle, isn't smarter than you, but it'll show you exactly how dumb you're being. The lads laughed, but not mockingly. Your fancy optics will tell you what to aim at, he continued, but your gut tells you when to breathe. And most of you, he added gently, have been breathing like you're still holding your kit list in your back pocket. There was another silence, not the tense kind from earlier, the kind where every word becomes a tool. That night, back at the barracks, Hughes sat on his bunk staring at his spotting scope. He hadn't cleaned it yet. It was still faintly fogged from earlier in the day. He reached for a cloth, paused, and just looked through it instead, through the haze, through the lens, through memory. Flashback. Arty Collins, age 24, Falklands, 1982. The trench was muddy, full of rain that wouldn't drain, and the air smelled of cordite and soaked wool. Arty lay prone, elbows in mud, chin resting just off a cold rock. A corporal beside him whispered, "You sure you've got the wind right?" Arty didn't answer. He was watching something small, a bootlace flag, part of a ration wrapper caught on a twig 200 yards downrange, fluttering out of sync with everything else. "I'm not listening to the wind," he finally muttered. "I'm listening to that bit of bin liner lying through its teeth." He clicked the dial left, just one, trusted it, fired. And when the target dropped, an Argentine machine gunner mid-run, he felt nothing. Not triumph, not sadness, just confirmation. Back in the present, Hughes finally smiled. Now he understood. Arty hadn't been teaching them how to shoot. He'd been teaching them how to trust what the land tells you when it stops lying. The following morning, Arty returned. Not because he was asked, not because anyone told him to. He just turned up again. Same coat, same rifle. A fresh tea biscuit in his tin. Colonel Fletcher had already cleared it. Whitaker made sure no one else got in his way. He didn't take over drills, he didn't set new targets. He just sat on the bench. And if someone wanted to ask a question, they did. If someone missed a shot, he didn't correct them. He just asked what they'd seen, not what the equipment said. By the end of the week, 3 of the lads had hit the 1400 plate on their own. Hughes did it twice, back to back. He didn't celebrate. He just looked at Arty. Arty didn't clap, didn't nod. He just said, "Now, do it when your heart's hammering and you've not slept in a day and someone's counting on you. That's when it matters." Weeks later, the Royal Marines quietly introduced a new section in their advanced sniper doctrine. Not flashy, not mandatory. A quiet edition. Collins Fieldcraft, wind pattern recognition, and mirage interpretation. Known informally as the shot through time doctrine. It was strange how quickly they fell into the rhythm. Not because anyone enforced it, not because the order came down, but because truth, once heard properly, echoes. Each morning, Arty arrived just before the sun topped the gorse hedges that ringed the western range. Same coat, same boots. Rifle slung across his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. A biscuit in his pocket, sometimes 2. He never stepped over the marker again. He didn't need to. They came to him now. It started with the younger lads. Jenkins asked first, tentative, fumbling. "Sir, about yesterday's mirage roll. You mentioned a shift from left curl to upward flow. How do you know when it switches?" Arty didn't answer with words. He pointed to the high grass out past the 900 berm. "Look at the shadow it casts when the wind lifts it." Jenkins frowned. "It doesn't have a shadow." "Exactly," Arty said. "Which means the shimmer is pulling it vertical. You'll catch it if you watch the edge, not the stem." Jenkins didn't fully understand, but he felt something click, and he didn't miss again that morning. By Thursday, 3 shooters had changed their logging habits. By Friday, the kestrels were being used, not trusted blindly. By Saturday, even Shaw carried his own wind chart, handwritten. And every single morning they found themselves on the mat before dawn, not because it was ordered, but because they wanted to understand what Arty saw. Not the target, the air. Staff Sergeant Riley Shaw didn't say much at first. He stayed in the background, letting the lads ask the questions.
But he watched. He listened. He made no attempt to reassert dominance, no attempt to brush Arty's presence aside. He just took it all in, like a man who'd been handed a manual for a machine he thought he already knew how to use and only now realized he'd skipped half the pages. It was late on Sunday morning when he finally approached. Arty was sitting alone under a hawthorn tree just west of the range, the rifle beside him, laid gently across two folded jackets. Shaw walked up slowly, no swagger, no pace, just quiet. He didn't salute, didn't speak for a moment. Then, "May I?" He gestured to the grass beside him. Arty shrugged. "Free country," he said. Shaw sat, adjusted his posture, hands clasped loosely between his knees. "You ever get tired of being right?" he asked. Arty didn't smile. He pulled out his tin and offered a biscuit. Shaw took one, bit into it. "I wasn't wrong," Arty said finally. "You were shooting clean, steady hand, good form. You just didn't know the wind's voice yet." Shaw chuckled softly. "I thought it was a whisper." "It is," Arty said, "but sometimes it whispers through things, through stone, through heat, through memory." Shaw looked out over the plain, now shimmering under the high morning sun. "I've been doing this for 16 years, he said. "Thought I knew the game. Thought it was just a better rifle, a tighter grouping, a newer scope." He paused. "It's not, is it?" "No," Arty said, eyes on the horizon. "It's a better question." That afternoon, Corporal Hughes made a shot that changed everything. Not because it was further, not because it was harder, because it was made without numbers. He'd been watching the horizon for nearly 7 minutes, quiet, still. Arty didn't coach. He didn't stand over him. He just sat behind the line and said nothing. Hughes called his wind. Soft boil off the stones, flicker left at 9, downdraft at the hollow, window at 11 for 2 seconds, right at the low shimmer. He breathed, held, fired. Clang. Dead center. The plate rang like a church bell, and the lads cheered, not because of the hit, but because of how it was made. Shaw approached, bent down, looked Hughes in the eye. "Well called," he said simply, and then he stepped back. Let him have the moment. Let him own it. That evening, after chow, Arty didn't stay for tea. He packed his rifle, walked down past the marker post, and paused. Shaw followed him, hands in pockets. "You heading off?" he asked. Arty nodded. "Same time next year?" Shaw offered, half a smile. Arty glanced back at the lads, still laughing around the fire pit, someone passing a canteen, Hughes sketching wind patterns in the dirt with a stick. "They don't need me anymore," he said. Shaw didn't argue. He just stood with him for a moment. "Thank you," he said, not as an officer, just as a man. Arty adjusted the strap on his rifle. Then, in a voice too quiet to be a lesson, but too clear to be forgotten, he said, "You were never wrong, son. Just reading the book when the weather was talking." He stepped into the twilight, boots silent on the dust, and was gone. The next morning the lads gathered without instruction. No instructor, no protocol. Just mats and silence. Then Shaw walked out, laid a blade of grass on the mat, and whispered, "What's it not doing?" The sign had been changed quietly. No memo, no ceremony, just a fresh placard mounted to the range entry gate the following month. The chalk-white board bore simple lettering in dark enamel paint. Range 7, Collins Line. Dedicated to those who read the wind, not just the manual. That was it. No rank, no medals, no pictures, just a name and a principle. It was Hughes who noticed it first. He was leading the new intake now, young Marines barely out of basic, hair still too neat, trigger fingers still tense with anticipation. They'd asked why the scope dial had no default 0. He pointed to the line, made them stand quiet,
let them feel the wind crawl over their collarbones, and then he nodded toward the sign. "You don't understand it yet," he said, "but that name there? That's the one who taught the Corps how to listen again." Back in town, a few weeks after the range redesignation, Staff Sergeant Shaw was kneeling in front of the tomato seed rack at the garden center on Bridge Street. He was frowning at a packet in his hand like it had personally insulted his entire bloodline. 15 centimeters apart, he muttered. "Is that before the first leaf set or after? Bloody thing doesn't say." A voice behind him, warm, dry, familiar. "You're planting 'em too close again." Shaw turned, blinked. There he was. Same coat, same glint of humor buried under 60 years of not needing to prove anything. "Mr. Collins," Shaw said, straightening instinctively. "Just Arty," the old man said, reaching past him to pick up a different brand of seeds. "These ones don't bolt as easy. More patient in the heat." Shaw took them, looked at the packet, didn't read it, just nodded. They stood in the aisle a moment, people passing by with trolleys and bags of compost. The air smelled like fertilizer and plastic, and over the radio in the rafters, someone was singing about summer being just around the corner. "I meant to write," Shaw said. Arty shrugged. "Didn't need to. We put your doctrine in the advanced training block. You didn't have to. We did it anyway." Arty smiled. Not broadly, just the corner of his mouth twitching like a clock ticking past the hour. He turned to go, then paused, looked over his shoulder. "You're a good soldier, Riley." Shaw swallowed. That one landed deeper than expected. "I wasn't," he said. "Not for a while. Doesn't matter. You are now." Arty turned back, walking slow but steady, the sunlight catching on the tin of biscuits in his coat pocket. Shaw watched him go, then looked back at the tomato seeds, smiled, picked up another packet just in case. The rifle, the L-42A1, was returned to the small heritage case in the regimental museum. They placed it back in the felt-lined box, now with a small brass tag beside it. "On loan each year by Mr. A. Collins, returned to storage only when not in use." No one asked what "in use" meant. They just knew. On a morning the following spring, Hughes walked the range alone. The dew still clung to the high grass. The wind was moving slow, left to right, but soft as breath. He set the mat down, didn't check his scope yet, didn't even ready the rifle. He just crouched, picked a blade of grass and held it between his fingers. Felt nothing, but noticed everything. And somewhere in that long, low silence that comes before the shot, he could still hear Arty Collins whispering, "Stop shouting. Start listening." He smiled, didn't fire, just listened, and it was enough. What this story really teaches us. There's a quiet kind of wisdom that never demands the spotlight. It doesn't wear medals or raise its voice. It just knows. And when the moment's right, it shows up, says its piece, and walks away, leaving everything subtly changed. Arty Collins didn't just fire a legendary shot. Meta. He reminded us that in a world full of noise, data, and tech telling us what to think, the most powerful tool we still have is our ability to listen, to the land, to each other, and to the things that aren't being said out loud. We live in a time where experience is often dismissed and where patience is mistaken for weakness. But this story shows that legacy isn't about age. It's about earned understanding. The kind you pass on not with a lecture, but with a look, a phrase. A single blade of grass held in the right light. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that humility doesn't mean shrinking. It means making space for others to grow, to learn, and eventually to lead. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone who taught you something valuable when they didn't have to, share this video with them. Or send it to someone who's just starting out, someone who could use a reminder. You don't need to shout to be heard. Tap that like button to help more people find this story. And if you'd like more tales of quiet strength and unspoken heroes, consider subscribing. Until next time, stay sharp, stay humble, and keep listening.